A bipolar world, as the name suggests, includes two global superpowers that have hegemony over their spheres of influence in the world. The bipolar world of the 20th century existed throughout the length of the Cold War and consisted of three main phases: confrontation from 1948 to 1962, détente from 1962 to 1979, and rapprochement from 1979 to 1992. The division of Europe was agreed to at the end of World War II, and Japan was nuked by the United States in 1945 to avoid Operation Downfall. The Soviets already knew that America had the atomic bomb and worked tirelessly to develop their own after the aftermath of World War II and successfully tested atomic weapons in 1949. This contributed to mutually assured destruction, which became the main policy for avoiding direct conflict between the two major powers. Additionally, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union demilitarized after World War II and continued armament production on relatively the same scale as they had done during the war. There are disagreements about when the Cold War truly began, with some arguing that it started with the Big Three dividing up Europe during World War II. Others argue that the first post-World War II proxy conflicts, such as the Greek Civil War and Iran crisis of 1945 to 1946, or the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, as well as other points of interest in the aftermath of World War II, were the start of the Cold War. During this period, both superpowers engaged in proxy wars and regime change without regards for blowback. Notable regional examples are the United States in Latin America and the Soviet Union in Africa. Both powers looked at the world in the short term regarding the Cold War, as each wanted as many states on their side as possible at any given time during the Cold War, and they would do so in the fastest way possible in coups and proxy wars, as well as in staging revolutions and rebellions in states in their adversary. This would be done in order to tie down resources and to capitalize on any gains. The UN was founded in 1945 to be what the League of Nations could not be, an international organization for peace with a Security Council whose 5 permanent members were the US, Britain, France, the USSR, and China. Each member had a veto power to a resolution, but one major issue during the Cold War was China's seat in the UN, as the Chinese Civil War had caused the PRC to conquer mainland China, but the ROK remained in the island of Taiwan. The UN conducted humanitarian, peacekeeping, and military interventions. During the Korean War, North Korea invaded the South, and the UN voted to send military forces to support South Korea. The resolution passed as Taiwan held China's seat in the UN, and due to that fact, the USSR boycotted the UN and therefore didn't veto the resolution, and UN forces were sent to Korea. The Korean War also showed the US and Western world that they couldn't use military forces the same way as they had done in World War II because of the Chinese intervention that occurred in the Korean War. And then the Korean War would become a limited war rather than a total war. Again, another distinction between World War II and the new Cold War era. The war would drag on into a relative stalemate until 1953, and many considered it to be the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. This would then impact how the US and SEATO approached the Vietnam War. Although the US and USSR were the two global hegemons, Britain and France remained global powers until 1956, when they were put in their place by the US and USSR during the Suez Crisis. Furthermore, both the US and Soviet Union vied for influence and the support of post-colonial states, as they both opposed colonialism and supported independence movements in Africa as well as across the rest of the world. But in Africa specifically, many states looked to both superpowers to support their independence movements and would receive it. Oftentimes, such as in the Portuguese colonial wars, the US, Soviet Union, and China supported different independence movements. There would also be subsequent civil wars after independence was achieved, and it's easier to start a revolution and unite competing groups against a common foe, but the real change and challenge is the day after the revolution, when all of these militias and various factions turn against one another after the colonial power has left. Cuba was also a major player in the Cold War despite being a small island nation. After the Cuban Revolution, Castro supported and led revolutionary movements all over the world, and Cuban foreign interventionism and internationalism was a major asset to the Soviet Union. Additionally, since Cuba was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, it became the Soviet Union's most valued ally within the Western Hemisphere. In some cases, such as the Congo Crisis and Simba Rebellion, states used mercenaries instead of foreign support due to massively complex geopolitical complications. And when I use the term to refer to the Congo Crisis as massively complex geopolitical complications, that is a massive understatement. But the point is that the mass mercenary employment was accelerated during the Cold War to fight for various states or to act as principal agents for one of the superpowers in conflicts. With the creations of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, as well as the division of the world into two major camps, the non-aligned movement spawned. Prominent Cold War states such as India, Egypt, and Yugoslavia participated in the non-aligned movement while also having some ties with one or both of the superpowers. Moving away from Africa, Indochina is an excellent example of a post-World War II region that experienced a violent transition of power to independence and a following civil war, with both sides of the Cold War knee-deep in the proxy war. The French lost the Indochina War, and the former French colony was divided up into Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. The events of the Vietnam War is pretty much common knowledge, but basically North and South Vietnam were fighting each other, and the Viet Cong also heavily attacked the South during the Vietnam War and used guerrilla and insurgency tactics. The U.S. had first sent advisors and special forces groups into Vietnam and slowly escalated, sending other forces into the country to not provoke China and repeat Korea. The war was also a limited war and had a draft which ended in 1972. The end of the war came with the Paris Peace Accords in 1973 as the U.S. withdrew most forces, but North Vietnam invaded the South again and Saigon fell in 1975, which officially ended the war with a communist victory. However, one element of the Vietnam War that isn't really talked about that much is that United States involvement was also part of a SEATO involvement of Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines, who intervened in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to protect those states. However, the alliance would dissolve in 1977 after the remaining member states were disinterested in what was going on. Turning to the Cold War in Europe, the Soviets had many clampdowns on Eastern Europe during the 1950s and 60s, with notable events being the Poznan protests in Poland and the Hungarian uprising, both of which took place in 1956 and were met with a strong response force by the Soviet Union. These events discredited Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies known as the Thaw, as satellite communist governments were hardcore Stalinists, especially those in Romania and East Germany, as the East Germans had the Stasi. Additionally, the 1968 Prague Spring protests were met by a Warsaw Pact invasion of the state. The Brezhnev Doctrine of the USSR proclaimed that any threats to socialist rule in the Soviet bloc would be a justification for a Soviet invasion, and it also sought to justify the previous Soviet suppressions in Eastern Europe. The Brezhnev Doctrine was then used to invade Afghanistan. Other conflicts occurred that had little to do with the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union, but both sides had interest in backing a side to gain an ally out of the conflict. However, there were some conflicts such as the Iran-Iraq War where both sides of the Cold War backed Iraq with some levels of support for Iran for various reasons which I won't get into here. Others occurred as various Arab-Israeli conflicts which had little to do with the Cold War, but I'm not going to get into those details. The confrontation phase of the Cold War was initiated by the Berlin blockade by the Soviet Union, which kicked off the Berlin crisis, where Soviet and American tanks had a standoff in 1948 as the city was closed off by the USSR. Here was also the first proxy wars, the space race where the Soviets launched Sputnik and sent Yuri Gagarin into space. The Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred a year later in 1962, where the world came very close to nuclear war in those 13 days, which ended the confrontation phase of the Cold War. The détente phase of the Cold War began after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after the world almost nuked itself, and major de-escalation occurred between the superpowers in this phase. The war in Vietnam occurred during this time, as did many Soviet and Cuban interventions in Africa. Détente saw the signing of the SALT agreements and the Helsinki Accords in 1975, where the U.S. agreed to recognize Soviet control over Eastern Europe, and in exchange the Soviets guaranteed human rights would be upheld even though they weren't. The Accords also emboldened a bolder Soviet interventionism foreign policy, which included supporting authoritarian rulers like Mengistu in Ethiopia and sending troops to Angola and Mozambique during their civil wars. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan also took place in 1979, which ended the détente phase. The rapprochement phase lasted from 1979 until 1992 and is marked as starting with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Additionally, this phase saw the Reagan era in which the United States shot up defense spending to cripple the Soviets. Reagan also began work with the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars system, to combat potential Soviet missiles. The U.S. also saw military expeditions to Grenada in Operation Urgent Fury and Honduras with Operation Golden Pheasant. Reagan also funded many groups that were anti-communist to further expend Soviet resources, including the Contras and Mujahideen. The USSR began to collapse due to many reasons, including the war in Afghanistan, Reagan coming in guns a-blazing, the the Chernobyl crisis, and other domestic factors. The Warsaw Pact also dissolved in 1989, and President George H.W. Bush handled the end of the Cold War with great care. The USSR officially dissolved in December of 1991, and the US and Russia began to cooperate in 1992. And that ends my very, very brief summary of the Cold War era and its phases of the bipolar world. Next week I will be covering the unipolar world and cover the post-Cold War, global war on terrorism, and the post-global war on terror / present-day era. I'll talk about America's place as the global hegemon from 1992 to 2021 and discuss China being a rising hegemon, Russian revisionism, and challenges to US hegemony since the fall of Kabul that had occurred. See you then if you like this video, and thank you for watching.